Welcome, and thank you for coming. I'm Deborah Slicer. I teach in the philosophy department, and I direct our graduate program in environmental philosophy. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight, Professor Nancy Sherman. The title of her talk is Afterwar, Healing the Moral Wounds of Our Soldiers. Her talk will be followed by a half-hour question and answer period. And I think there are mics in the aisle. I'll help out with this. And then after the question answer, there's a half-hour book signing in the lobby where she has copies of her most recent book, Afterwar. Can you hear me? Okay. Alrighty. First, though, some general announcements and some thank yous. As you all know, this lecture is part of the Presidential Lecture Series, and the lecture series has been open and free to the public for 30 years now. Due to increasing cost associated with the lecture series, if you'd like to make a contribution to the series, there are payment information cards in the lobby, or you can just go online to the UM website under Presidential Lecture Series and contribute something to our next season. Thank you. I'd like to thank, first of all, President Sheila Stearns for her enthusiastic support of this series. And I'd like to thank Professor Richard Drake, who is the force that coordinates and keeps this series going year after year through good times, bad times, and on into the present. And our several sponsors, the Department of Philosophy, the Psychology Department, the Department of Military Science, the Bugbee family, and the President's Office. This particular lecture is in honor of Henry Bugbee. He's a former colleague of mine in the philosophy department. He taught philosophy, and he taught in the intensive humanities course here for 20 years. He was teaching from roughly 1957 through 1977 when he retired. His very influential book, The Inward Mourning, was a day-by-day compilation of philosophical reflections, and it went to its third edition. His admirers refer to him as a humanist par excellence, I'm quoting, a genius who naturally, generously, and graciously shared his gifts, a wilderness advocate whose testimonies at wilderness hearings were, quote, spectacular. I bet they were. And the preeminent American analytic philosopher Willard Quine said, quote, Henry is the ultimate exemplar of the examined life. He portrayed the mystical sense of pure poetry, the pure poetry of being, and I'll add with a fly rod. He passed in December 1999. Many thanks to Henry Bugbee and to Henry Bugbee's family, many of whom are here tonight. Oh, thank you. Okay, Nancy Sherman. I'm going to start with some basic resume items. First of all, she earned her PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 1982, where I learned she worked with Martha Nussbaum and John Rawls. It's quite the duo there. She's currently a university professor of philosophy at Georgetown University in DC. She's been there since 2001. She's also faculty affiliate at the Kennedy Center of Ethics at Georgetown University. She's an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She's faculty affiliate, Georgetown University Law Center on National Security and Law. And she was, for 2 years, the inaugural holder of the Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. That was from 97 through 99. She currently is doing something so cool. She has a fellowship at NYU with the Center for Ballet and the Arts, where she's thinking about writing about dance and the military. She talked about that a bit in the afternoon. And she's spending a lot of time with some fabulous professional dancers and choreographers in New York City. Her honors and fellowships include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Woodrow Wilson International Center for the Scholars Public Policy Fellowship and Scholarship. She was the Air Force Academy's Outstanding Educator in 2012 in conjunction with the selection of her book, The Untold War, as an outstanding recent book in the humanities and war. She's the sole author of 5 books and the co-editor of 2 other books. She's co-edited 2 books in Virtue, or 1 book in Virtue, Aristotle's Ethics, and then co-edited 2 volumes on the ethics for military leaders. Her sole-authored books include 2 in Character and Virtue, 1 on Kant and Aristotle, and the other on Aristotle's virtues. And then 3 books in soldiering and military ethics. And those titles include Stoic Warriors, The Ancient Philosophy Behind the Military Mind, that was with Oxford in 2005. The Untold War, Inside the Hearts, Minds, and Souls of Our Soldiers, that was with Norton in 2011. And most recently, Afterwar, Healing the Moral Wounds of Our Soldiers, and that was with Oxford in 2015. And that book is on sale in the lobby, and she'll be signing those after the Q&A session. I could go on for a very long time here. There's so much, and she has such an interesting vita. Her op-ed and popular pieces have been published with Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the LA Times, the Boston Globe. She's done radio and TV appearances with the BBC, NPR, PBS, This American Life, ABC News, Fox News, MSNBC, and the Huffington Post. Oh, it's quite a career. Now, for a few more specifics, and then I'll let her come up here and talk with you. I've regularly taught advanced courses in morality and war for about 10 years here at the university. And in that course, we talk about the usual issues in just war theory. We talk about just reasons for going to war, and we talk about just conduct once you're in war, and we talk about after war. We talk mostly about reparations. And veterans do take this course on a regular basis, and almost without exception, those veterans have been deployed at various times, almost always in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in both places. And some have been deployed there multiple times. And they almost inevitably kind of process what they've witnessed and what they've done in war, either in class or in my office or in both places. And when they're processing, when they're sharing, I've always considered that a gift. But I've always had the nagging sense that the course material wasn't really addressing their most important experiences or questions or concerns. And that became very apparent to me 2 years ago when one of my vet students was suffering very acutely from an episode of PTS. And I decided at that point I wasn't teaching the course anymore. I was done. It was irrelevant. It wasn't speaking to this man and to a lot of my veterans. It was a lot of academic jabbering. I was done. And then it was just a few days later, I picked up an Oxford flyer, a flyer from Oxford University Press, and I was flipping through it, and I found Nancy Sherman's book, Afterwar. It had just been released. I read the blurb, and then I read the book right away. And then I read her other books. I read The Stoic Warriors, and I read Afterwar most recently. And I could see right away how original and how practical and how necessary these books were to helping all of us appreciate a soldier's experience from recruitment to homecoming. And when I say her work is original, I mean the following four things. Her work is always, always, always grounded in her interviews and classroom experiences with literally hundreds of soldiers that she's worked with over the years, and with her military colleagues, and with soldiers' families. And that's unique, that's different in this literature, most of the literature. She's, number two, a graduate of the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute, and she's also a virtue ethicist. So that means she's a student of the psyche and of moral character. So she's more interested in how individual soldiers think, feel, choose, than in the finer distinctions between preemptive and preventative war, or she's more interested in that than in whether the moral doctrine of the double effect really does excuse collateral damage, or in the differences, the moral differences between active and status targets, for example, all the usual stuff of just war theory. And I liked that. The third thing I mean when I say that she's original, and you may have gathered this, is that her work is just especially relevant and practical to the current military and to our current military situation, which is why she was invited to teach at the U.S. Naval Academy, why she was awarded the Outstanding Educator Award by the U.S. Air Force Academy, and why she was part of a small invited team, a team invited by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs to visit Guantanamo Bay Detention Center to observe and advise on medical and psychological conditions of detainees and on matters of their medical care and medical ethics. And then finally, her work is original, and especially Afterwar is an original book, and she'll talk about that one tonight, because it's largely about closure, about post-conflict, and historically there isn't as much literature in that area as there is on just cause and on just conduct, and it's nice to see more of it. Most of the conduct literature looks at reparations between states after war. But Sherman does something really different and so worthwhile, I think. She's interested in how individual soldiers achieve closure, and if not closure, at least get on with life. She's interested in their moral wounds, their moral injuries, which are as severe as their physical injuries, they're as severe as more well-known psychological injuries, as PTSD. So I'll let her finish the story from here. We're very honored. We're very, very pleased to have you here in Missoula and at the University of Montana. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Those are wonderfully generous words, and I'm really grateful. And the conversation did begin thinking about our students, which I take very seriously. I owe many thanks for this kind invitation to Missoula, my second time in this wonderful city. First to President Sheila Stearns and Penny Newbold of her office. Thank you so much for organizing this. To the Bugbee family, I see some of them, thank you so much. Your father was someone I think I would have liked to have known. I'm sorry we didn't overlap at Harvard. To Deborah, of course, the philosophy department, to Richard Drake, to coordinating this for the president's office, to veteran and military studies. And I owe thanks to the veterans and service members in this community, whom I gather are very numerous and in this state. My own work has been a way of shaping a conversation that really tries to go beyond the thin crust of thank you for your service. That was what I really took my mission to be. So I hope that I succeed in doing some of that through my work and tonight through what I have to say. So let me just juggle a few pieces of paper and then move on. So my work is really about breaking the mil-civ divide, military-civilian divide, so that service members can come home and thrive to the best degree possible. And remember, after the longest wars in our country and ongoing wars, we're redeploying as I speak. Over the past decade, as Deborah suggested, I've been in classes with service members who are trying to come home, and Afterwar was listening to their stories, and in a sense, I felt I was embedding in a very attenuated way, but I was. So just some facts, 2.7 million troops have returned from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, half of them with children, so that means 4 million military children. They don't wear uniforms, you often don't see them, but they do carry the burdens of war in the public school system and private schools. 22 million veterans in America. So, and the new service numbers are often post 9/11, but making up, again, not in this state, but nationwide, about 1% of the population, 0.5%. So, to many, even in my hometown, DC, or Bethesda, we're home of Bethesda Naval, Walter Reed now, National Military Medical Center it's called. Camis, folks in camis are still kind of an exotic breed, but I really think it's time to break down the defenses and both sides to come out of the bunkers. So, and that's a new book. For me, this is somewhat personal. My dad was a World War II veteran. He was a medic, and he went across on the Queens. The Queens were Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the Cunard lines now. When he died at 89, I was, and still am to my mother, a very close daughter. So I cleaned up his effects, and I found his dog tags in his pocket on his keychain. Now, I didn't know he carried them. We must have had a don't ask, don't tell policy. But as close a daughter as I was, I didn't know that. So not talking, which was the mode of that laconic generation, was not healthy for him. It wasn't healthy for me. And so that pact of silence, I think, is something I'm trying to undo. And I think our generation is doing a lot better than my generation did. Moral injury is a buzzword these days in the press, and increasingly it's gaining importance in research and clinical literature on psychological wounds of war. And all this is to the good, because I think PTSD, post-traumatic stress, some people drop the D because disorder, the D for disorder, they find stigmatizing, was a 1980s DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual diagnosis for a conditioned fear response to life threat. And that just doesn't capture the moral dimensions of psychological anguish many service members and veterans experience. at home and abroad. It can mix with fear, but fear response isn't the only thing. Remember, 1980s is still the heyday of behavioral psychology, and this was a very important diagnosis then. It really captured what women were going through, rape victims, what men were seeing coming home from Vietnam, and women service members that were in the forces. But it doesn't often, and though DSM-5 has changed the diagnosis to include mention of guilt and shame, it often doesn't explore the moral and personal responsibility so central to military training and its induction of members into a cadre whose ethos just is to serve others and to be part of something larger than self. Now, as Deborah was suggesting, philosophers have often been on the sidelines of this conversation, preferring to talk about Augustine and Aquinas era just war theory, and that's been very exciting in the past 20 years. There's been a huge resurgence of very, very good jus ad bellum, going to war, in bello, in war, post bellum, after war. But we have a lot to say, too, about taking responsibility and the emotions that register it, and that's been my interest. So following the lead of P.F. Strawson, a British philosopher, in 1962, very famous article, Freedom and Resentment, Freedom of the Will, Resentment and Freedom of the Will, I think it's called. Philosophers talk about emotions that register a sense of accountability, taking account, holding to account. And on the negative side, they could include guilt, shame, moral disappointment toward self, resentment, moral disappointment toward others, sense of betrayal. Positive side, trust, hope, forgiveness, empathy toward others, toward yourself. So in my view, these attitudes of holding self and others to account are critical for fleshing out the notion of moral injury and how it's experienced in communicatively. So, and tonight, what I want to talk a little bit about, as I did this afternoon a tiny bit, we talk about the attitudes, we often don't talk about how we express those attitudes, how we navigate the transactive space, the normative space. And I think that interpersonal area is very important for sowing the seeds for moral healing. So the plan is this. I want to consider this normative space, if I can call it that, interpersonal normative space. And the challenges of communicating it at times through hoping in persons or trusting in them. And I want to weave contemporary stories through long interviews I've had over the years with some of my students and others, with ancient ones, retold by a general himself, but more famously, a tragedian named Sophocles, in his plays Ajax and Philoctetes. And along the way, tonight especially, I want to draw on stories that have come to me from women, because I think we often eclipse and occlude the role of women service members and the moral injuries they suffer. So the notion of moral injury, we can say moral damage, moral harm, if you like, has a long history. Anyone talking about injustice and being wronged, as Socrates does, is going to, now I'm thinking of the Apology and Crito, is going to be talking about moral injury. In Socrates' case, as with the Stoics who followed his lead, the seminal notion is that one can be morally damaged or harmed only as the perpetrator. No one can do harm to you, Socrates says, but you can only do harm to others. So you can do harm as a wrongdoer, but that's about it. And the idea of moral disease and resilience and what you yourself can do to yourself through failures of agency and in turn mastery is just an enduring Stoic theme. Discipline, the good person harms no one and is not harmed by anyone, because the only real evil you can suffer is the wrongdoing that you yourself do. So that, in a sense, is a kind of beginning of moral injury, and I have to say the military academies are very good in teaching Stoicism. Epictetus is a favorite, I discovered. Earlier than this, the Greek tragedies and the Homeric traditions that they are based on depict moral injury very graphically. So I'm in part saying this is not an invention. Moral injury is not a 20th century, 21st invention. Jonathan Shea didn't invent it. I didn't invent it. The clinicians didn't invent it. It has been around a long time. And it's perhaps clearest in Ajax, Sophocles' play. So we know Ajax from Homer. And Ajax is the Achaean, he's a giant of battle, giant god of battle. He's the bulwark of the Achaeans, of the Greeks. He's powerful and well-built, unrivaled as a fighter. His warrior medal is storied, and so is his father's, and that's a heavy burden on him. And of course, it's Ajax, this is Thetis bringing Achilles his armor, but it's Ajax who carries Achilles off the battlefield and takes him to the Achaean warships. And he expected at the end of the day that when it came time to get Achilles' armor, which you see there, it was going to be he, the strongest and the giant god of battle, that would get it. But it went to Odysseus, the speechifier Odysseus, wily Odysseus. And that causes Ajax to have essentially what we call a dissociative break. He is paralyzed, and he can't believe that he's been ashamed in front of his troops, and that he's lost his time, his honor, like being stripped of his badges. And he says, I will return to Troy having earned nothing. How could my father even stand to look at me? His shame is global. And remember, you may not know, the Greek word for shame is eidos, and it comes from oidoia, and oidoia means genitals. So he is stripped without his fig leaf. He is exposed, and shame is often so humiliating because it's exposure. And in a peak of blazing rage, he is going to show everyone that he is still the unrivaled swordsman, and he's going to kill Odysseus. But what happens? Athena blinds him, and in his dissociative rage, he kills only the barnyard animals. And he, as it said in the play, he hacked at this chief and that chief, but they were really sheep and cows. And that disgrace piled onto the old disgrace was enough for, in an unrivaled moment on Greek stage, for Achilles to commit suicide at the point of his dagger. Now, I have seen this play, some of you may have, put on by the Theater of War and also by Aquila Theater at NYU, an NEH sponsored group, and I've seen it with soldiers, and one of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard, all service members and veterans. And one such person that I was on a panel with and got to know fairly well is retired Army Major helicopter pilot Jeff Hall. I'll tell his story only very briefly now as a teaser. It's in the book, but he's essentially in Iraq 05, trained always to engage and destroy, but that's not what he was doing in laying sewers, building schools, reaching out and doing civilian work. And at one point he was caught, he was an observer in an area where there was a collateral incident. It was a valuable target, high target operation, and he was tasked to clean it up and to get the bodies back to the daughter who survived and her uncle. This became about a 3 to 5 month horror tragedy in which the bodies decayed in the scorching heat. His commander couldn't work with the Iraqi Ministry of Health or with the Iraqi Defense. This was the day of Paul Bremer's CPA, what was called Coalition Provisional Agency, which was a bureaucratic nightmare and a bad example of coalition work. And some of you may have been there then. At any rate, when he finally got the bodies back and they were returned, and he could produce them to this family, a young girl, his children's own age, his own girl's age, and to the uncle after he had given them what he said was a piddling $750 as solace money. The death certificates were stamped in bold red letters, enemy. And it was the last straw. And he said, they're not enemies, they're civilians. And the official, the Ministry of Health official, curtly replied, no, they're considered enemies. At which point, Jeff decompensated, essentially. I mean, he said to me, you have to understand, my PTS has everything to do with moral injury. It wasn't from killing or seeing bodies severed or collateral incidents. That's war. It was from betrayal, moral betrayal. That's one, you might say, cause, and that's a mask he made at Walter Reed. I will show you more masks. This is a sense of being mired in mud. He was a very good artist. And very briefly, National Geographic ran something, and that's a picture of him, his family. I'll come back to this in a sec. So, to many others who've dealt with a complicated grief, it's betrayal, but it's too many lost without quite knowing why. So that's an ancient glimpse at war. I'll bring it back to the ancients for a minute. But the moderns also came up with the idea of moral injury, and that's Bishop Butler. The sermons in the 18th century, 1726, Rawls Chapel in London. He also, I discovered, was the bishop in Durham, where I was staying once, and Durham, England. And his notion was that resentment is a Christian virtue. If you are morally injured, there's morally injurious offense taken to you, resentment is the proper response. So it was a very radical thought. Don't turn a cheek. Resentment and anger actually could be morally apt and appropriate. Now, much more can be said about the historical roots, but for now, as I use the term, let's get some definitions out here. I'm not a clinician. I'm not filing insurance forms. I want to call out the broadly moral dimensions of psychological anguish, here to do with war and military service, but by no means limited to it. And in the military, on the battlefield or off. The injuries can be on occasions of assaultive, violent, visceral experiences, killings, collateral damages, torturings, grotesqueries of war, but also crucially more critical interpersonal transactions, physical and verbal, to do with betrayals, as we've just seen, profound breaches of goodwill, violations of dignitary respect, exploitation, discrimination, harassment, scapegoating, rape, much more. And the latter, and not the grotesqueries of war, are often the recurrent themes in my interviews with service members. So, and my focus isn't on the stressors, but on the response and how the attitude and how it's communicated, how we hold ourselves and others accountable. It can be, the attitudes can be in your role as agent, in your role as victim, in your role as bystander, witness. And we forget the witnesses are critical. Journalists go to war. The pool is small right now. The journalist war pool is very small. You don't see many going to Syria. That is not a byline that you see in the Times, the Post, the Globe, the LA Times, whatever your local is, Missoulian. And I was reminded of this by one of my favorite writers, C.J. Chivers of the New York Times, a former Marine, immersed for 10 years in war. Immersed conflict is his thing. And he influenced one of my students, and I just sort of showcase him, who came to my classes, a Marine, T.M. Gibbons Neff, who now is himself a war journalist, former Marine for the Washington Post, going back to areas where he's been. He was in Marja, and he covers sometimes Afghanistan. But the point of view of the observer is critical. And I mention this because this is a very iconic image. You might remember it, Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down, Somalia, 1993. The person that took that is Paul Watson, and that is Sergeant David Cleveland being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. There was a play recently I saw at Theater J, the JCC in DC, The Body of an American, about what Watson believed he heard whispered when he took that picture. He heard Sergeant Cleveland say to him, "If you do this, I will own you forever." Now that is witness guilt, accountability. He took a picture, so there's agency, but that was the nub of crippling guilt for a lifetime. So we mustn't forget the journalists that go to war and are in war and live war. They are part of the moral injury story. So the blaming can be, it's address, it can be first personal to yourself in the form of guilt or shame for falling short of standards, guilt for commissions and omissions. Second personal to you, Butler was talking about resentment at being injured. It can be third personal on behalf of others, moral protest and indignation. And you can experience those moral addresses cross-role as perpetrator, victim, witness. But they also, moral injury can be experienced more diffusely. And many in the clinical profession like to talk about shattered moral identity. Brett Litz talks a lot about that. Profound moral disillusionment, moral dislocation. And it's not surprising these are the feelings so common in war, because war exacerbates not only a feeling of helplessness, that you might experience PTSD symptoms of hypervigilance, flashbacks, and dissociation, but also just a sense of unjustified killing with unjust or morally ambiguous conduct or cause or sense of reparation afterwards. These are just a part of it. And I want to share with you, I have permission to share these. These are produced at Walter Reed under the guidance of Melissa Walker, their art therapist. This afternoon we talked about movement therapy that's done there. There's also art therapy. These masks unmask trauma. They are a way of talking. They're a way of showing, displaying, expressing, communicating, making public what you can't say necessarily. They begin with paper mache masks, and they work these together. It can be in combination with talk therapy, dance movement therapy. Gives you a sense of, a profound sense, when I talk about emotional expression. Those express emotions, they may not say it, but they surely do. The variety of these masks suggest no universal moral injury, no more, if you remember the Donovan song, no universal soldier. Moral injury is a spectral notion, ebbs and flows, we were talking this afternoon, very delayed onset sometimes. Apt or inapt, tracking real or apparent only wrongdoing falling short. So I say that for all too often, even by clinicians, that you didn't really do something, that you're not really wrong. The fact that what you're feeling isn't tracking culpability, as in survivor guilt perhaps, sometimes seems unreasonable. But we have to remember, the military is very good at teaching lofty ideals delivered in moral absolutes. Never leave a fallen comrade behind, cover each other's back, bring your troops home. They're what we would call imperfect moral duties that can't be perfectly fulfilled. But if you're a young service member with a black and white sense of morality, which sometimes you come into the military with, and it sure sometimes gets enforced there, can-do mentality, a frontal cortex that's not fully formed, and too little sleep, and an autonomic nervous system on fine trigger, then you don't always grasp that fine point. and many just hold themselves, to use a legal term, strictly liable. And that, mixed with a zero-defect management policy, can be lethal. And so that's background to much of what I think about in my work. Now, consider a case of moral injury we don't think about that much. And this is Miriam Krieger. She's Roberta in the book, Air Force pilot. Major, she has given me permission to use her name. She has been in the Office of the Joint Chiefs, and she's a PhD student, or already a PhD in international studies at Georgetown. So a number of years ago, she and I met, and I heard her story. Remarkably distinguished career, Air Force Academy, high honors. When she arrived on base, this is stateside, her commander said he fought against her appointment and would continue to do everything to undermine it because she was female and he preferred an all-male unit. Remember when the academies went co-ed? 1976, I think. So we've had an integrated force for a long time, not necessarily in fighting. The tenor of his complaint was the tenor on base, and she parodied a well-established lingo for me. Her very presence was disrupting the status quo and tearing down heritage and tradition. Now, she was a threat, essentially, to what any of my friends at West Point will say is the entrenched and sacred culture of hypermasculinity. Those are the words the guys use in her service branch, but across those service branches in general. She wasn't giving up. Since she was 4 or 5, she wanted to be a fighter pilot, and so she was going to be a fighter pilot. Now, it was clear in talking to Roberta, Miriam, that let's think about the moral attitudes here, the reactive attitudes. Resentment, to be sure. Deep anger for her superior's mistreatment of her. And there was a transgression, a legal transgression. He was failing to comply morally and legally with the norms for fair and equal treatment. But also morally. She had been degraded, demeaned, told that she wasn't fit to serve there, and that she was disrupting his military. But she also felt what we don't think about very much, and that's moral disappointment. She felt miserably let down, and I don't just mean like a balloon popped. Someone had violated her sense of what norms he should be fulfilling and modeling on base. And these were reasonable moral expectations she had of him, and he failed them. And she wanted to communicate that to him, but she knew it would fall on flat ears. And on top of this, she was disappointed in herself. She felt angry for being angry or disappointed. And she said she always thought she had to sing the cadences, which are can be very highly sexist, louder than any of the guys at the beer halls. So she was sort of outgrowing the bros. Freud would say she was identifying with the aggressor. And she knew it, and she felt she was going soft on her own values. She came from a very feminist background. Her mother was a judge. So she said that what I felt was, as a pilot, I felt that same kind of spatial disorientation you feel when you are in high G-force accelerations. She was dislocated, morally dislocated, but it felt just like spatial dislocation. And so she used the term often overused, but here very apt. She felt she lost her moral compass. And what was fascinating for me is that the only way she could get out of that normative isolation and a sense of marginalization is by calling in a male mentor. And she did. Someone who had the same number of stripes and stars on his epaulets as the guy on base and could do her bidding because he could hear what she couldn't communicate. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling, to have a strong sense of being morally violated and not knowing how to express it in a way where there will be uptake. And it wasn't that he couldn't get it or didn't get it, this commander, but it was that he wouldn't easily get it because so much individually and collectively is invested in not getting it. And so that, I mean, I've been in that situation in other kinds of worlds, and that I think is very important to take seriously. When people don't report legally, or they don't report in other ways, or simply are at a deadlock, it is not because they don't have the feelings or have the attitudes, the moral injuries. It's they don't have a safe space to be able to express them or actually change the game. Get uptake. She wanted to keep this guy in the game, to use the metaphor I used this afternoon of Seneca. She wanted to play catch with him. She wanted him to catch the ball, but she didn't know where, how high, how low to throw it in order to get uptake. And only someone who had more authority could throw it. So it's a kind of, I think of it, reactive attitudes as moral addresses. It's a call and response. Can I count on you? Can I count on you to hear me? Can I count on you to count on me in response? It's like a game of catch in a certain way. And call and response is, of course, a gospel term. Also, the world of rock and roll made a living of it with backup singers who were the respondents. If you haven't seen 20 Feet from Stardom, go see it, just about call and response in the gospel world of rock and roll, and women that are 20 feet from the limelight. I'll leave Seneca to the side because we talked about it a little bit this afternoon, but I do want to point out that what's going on here, again, is not sincere revealing of your heart and avowal. It's finding the right normative transactive space where you can actually change a listener and try to bootstrap change. In this case, make for a less sexist environment. All right, so the point I'm sort of circling around is disappointment in those who oppress you or fail you in morally profound ways. They're violations of dignity, status, equal standing, and of law as well. And they're a kind of sense also many women have that they just don't have the emotional language, the right language that to be able to make those points. Consider another case. This one more to do with trust than hope, but as with hope, involves induction of another into normative space, moving them along to educating. This is not the person, but we kind of get a sense. And to be fair to the Navy, this is a young sailor, probably commander at this point that I know, named Alicia Haran. But the woman I'm going to tell you about is named Sally in the book. And she struggled with how to report to her supervisor on a base in Iraq a repeated pattern of incidents that kept her on high alert inside the wire all day. It began at crack of dawn at chow. All heads lifted when she walked in. I felt like a deer in hunting season, she said. And what upset her the most was that it was the officers that led in the staring. And then they would look down, and a quick look down, because they had this look of shame that they're supposed to be protecting me, but they're the ones that are ogling. And then visits to porta-potties, where there'd be graffiti and fear of being in a porta-potty downrange. And often what to do with malodorous tampons. Halliburton hadn't thought about that at the time. She was then stalked on email with rumors going viral about a relationship on base that hadn't happened. But what hit her hardest was the laundry incident, as she told me very cautiously. I said, "What's the laundry incident?" Well, she said, "I was doing my laundry, and I went out for a moment between cycles. When I came back to put my laundry in, all my bras and panties were stolen." Now, she's a young woman, 21, 20. She felt awkward writing home to her mom, not for the usual care package, but for underwear. And she didn't want to explain why. But the real communication challenge became explaining to her commander. She knew she was deeply anxious as a result of this and ongoing harassment. She couldn't work well, sleep well. It was affecting her combat readiness in her professional life. But she also knew she was in a war zone, and there are far greater global threats looming. And she didn't think her complaints would have credence. Again, will there be uptake? Especially, as she put it, the weird underwear theft incident. And it was embarrassing enough to tell your mother, but then to have to tell your commander. And she thought that was just the kind of testimonial that would be mocked and used against her and thought of as trivial in the middle of a war zone. And she had her own doubts about her entitlements to make the claims on other grounds. She worried that she might not be compassionate. This was a big worry. Maybe I'm not compassionate enough, she'd say, Professor Sherman, toward these guys who were predators. That's what she said. I'm sure in an all-male shop, the sexual urge was a little more rampant and the frustration dealing with that built up. I always struggled every day with whether I was compassionate enough for them. I always struggled with how much I could put up with and how much I couldn't. And this is not just about war zone, this is about campuses as well. Her ambivalence about what she suffered, her minimizing the harassment, both on account of being in a war zone and because males might have good reason to be randy, made it hard for her to come forward. But she also incorporated a readiness to forgive her into her own ability to feel resentment and disappointment. She worried what she had wasn't maybe reasonable disappointment, reasonable resentment. And so she questioned the legitimacy of her complaints. But once she got clearer and she went to her supervisor to raise it, she faced a pragmatic issue. How was she going to really be effective? And so again, the pragmatics of the attitude communication, that was the expressive challenge. So we can imagine trust exchanges or calls and responses. Can I count on you to count on you? You ask the question before you ask the question. Can I ask you a question? You're asking, do I have standing in your presence to be able to count on you? And that's what she felt. So in the end, she didn't feel she actually did too well. Because what happened? She ended up wearing a knife around her neck when she went into Chow Hall. That's how she resolved this. So I'm going to wrap up with Philoctetes, because the night is getting long and you have come out. So this is, in part, we know a little bit about trust in terms of interrogation. Interrogation is about manipulating trust. I was having a conversation with Sean at dinner tonight. Good interrogators build rapport. They manipulate trust. They ask, can I count on you? And the person says yes, and then they take you for a ride, so to speak. But it's not only that there's a kind of exploitation of in the role of interrogators. Sometimes interrogators become manipulated by those on the other side as well. Psychoanalysis, you'd say there's countertransference, vulnerability on both sides, or the Stockholm syndrome. The interrogator becomes allied with the interrogated. The manipulations work both ways. And this is a subject of General Sophocles, tragedian Sophocles, Philoctetes. And I'll be very brief, but it reminds us of how delicate trust is. The plot line is this. Young Neoptolemus is to do wily Odysseus' bidding and lure from Philoctetes the sacred bow that is the only last, excuse the metaphor here, Trojan horse that the Achaeans have against the Trojans. This guy, Philoctetes, has been marooned on an island of what? Lesbos. We know it now, where many others are now abandoned. And he is abandoned because of the stench of his wound. He has a fetid wound. The sailors can't stand his screaming anymore, and it's time to get rid of this excess baggage. So he's left on the island until he becomes an asset, or at least his weapon is an asset, his bow. And he's lonely. He's so desperate for friendship. And along comes this Neoptolemus, which means, that means young warrior, and Philoctetes means friend lover, or ready to be a friend. And there's a whole, the play is about stage trustworthiness. Neoptolemus is going to get Philoctetes to trust him so he can take his bow. And I won't tell you that much more about the play. I outline it in the book. But what it sort of suggests is that often it's not just that Neoptolemus was trying to move Philoctetes along to be trusted. Philoctetes, in the exchange, moved Neoptolemus along to actually become a trustworthy friend. And so there was this call and response that was reciprocal and worked in both ways. The enactments went in both directions, and there was movement and growth on both sides. And I think that's an important lesson for thinking not only about interrogation and how those relationships prey on both sides, but also for thinking about complicated trust dances or maneuvers. So this takes me to full circle, and that is the work. There's work to be done, and moral work to be done in trusting alliances, both in clinical space and non-clinical space. And my own work has been with service members in non-clinical space, in the classroom, often with safe texts like Philoctetes or Ajax or Socrates or Epictetus's handbook or Seneca's On Anger. And I think we as academics just are part of the homecoming. We serve in critical roles, each from our own discipline and in our various mentoring. And we do close up what we're asking citizen soldiers to go to war, and we ourselves as citizens have to be part of serving them when they come home, and also deciding on the wars that we allow them to serve in. I really do believe we owe it to our warrior scholars that we responsibly engage with them about war, about its causes, its conduct, and about its injuries. And I also think we need to, when we think about moral injuries, I suggest, look carefully at the microtexture, the fabric of communication, whether it be women who can't find a voice, transgendered who can't find a voice, minorities, blacks, or simply a subordinate who can't figure out how to tell the emperor he has no clothes at various times. I think we're part of that. And so I think in a certain way, if we go back to call and response, if you know, military cadences are call and response. They're often deeply misogynistic reciprocating addresses. And I've been suggesting we look at transactions and communications, much of today in both talks, across persons, across ranks, across disciplines, as forms of call and response to do with moral address and moral reply and how we hold ourselves and others responsible. These transactions, like the cadences, can be vehicles for very hurtful and injurious communications, but they can also be vehicles for moral healing and the transactional space for moving on with hope, trust, and the restoration of goodwill. Thank you very much.
There are microphones on both sides of the aisle, so we invite questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please come to a mic so everyone can hear you.
Don't be shy. This, by the way, is a non-staged picture. It's cadets at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, who were waiting for Allen Ginsberg to teach them about Howl. The gardener for Allen Ginsberg took this picture, who was also an English instructor at VMI.
Hello, Dr.
Hi.
Sherman. Hi. Thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure.
My name is
Thank
Serge Michaud, and I'm a veteran, and I work with some veteran service organizations here. I heard you saying at the end that struck me a lot, engage with veterans, you know, for they can engage with the community when they're coming back. That's one of the things that I've been trying to do with other veterans. My main focus always has been, you know, when you serve your country, when you get out, go to work, or if not, go to school. Most of us have the GI Bill, and if not, help your community. Always do something instead of sitting around and getting all those thoughts going around your head. Right. What would you say, with all your expertise, would be the best to work with veterans? How to adapt them back into the community?
Wow, I think there's no shortage of ways, but thank you for the question. Continuing service and a model of service is so important and meaningful, and a cause larger than yourself is always critical. We were talking over dinner about Team Red, White, and Blue, I guess, is one of the groups, so they do more recreational outings. Team Rubicon is one I know that does a lot of rebuilding of community, sometimes in Central America, sometimes locally. There's something's going on there. There's no shortage of such groups, and I think those are two that I know that have reasonable track records. There's also, of course, you live in God's nature, and there's outdoors, and being part of activities that take you outdoors. There's a group called Huts for Vets, Colorado-based. Weekends together in nature, humping it a bit, but in actually nice huts, where I think they bring a psychologist on board, and I've seen a little bit of that program. So I think you've got the right idea.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
It was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I met a veteran who lived under a bed for 12 years because of his involvement in the atomic bomb testing. And I wonder if you can speak to that.
Because of his involvement in what?
Atomic bomb testing in the 1950s. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that man, even though you don't know him.
And I'm sorry, you met a man who
lived under a bed for
who
12 years.
Who lived, I didn't hear the...
He lived under a bed for 12 years.
That's what I didn't hear.
He took his meals under the bed.
Wow.
He had been profoundly affected by his contact with radiation and radioactive warfare.
And physically, you're saying, and not just mentally. I don't know the story, so I can't, yeah.
Just emotionally, he could walk and talk and just as normally as you and I. But he'd become profoundly frightened and was afraid to come out from under a bed.
So it was fear, yeah. Exposure to war and to blasts. We know, these days we know much more about blasts than we ever thought we would know. Frankly, the first few years when I talked to at Walter Reed, were seeing people come home, they had no idea that TBI, traumatic brain injury, would be the signature disease of the wars. But they are. We have in our midst a man who's has dealt with IEDs, just lost the explosive devices, improvised explosive devices, and other kinds of rockets have caused concussive disorders, and there's all sorts of scientifically competitive views of how much, and naming and silo separation and competition for funds, whether you put PTSD together in the same title as TBI or traumatic brain injury, or not, and does TBI have a slightly different trajectory, and is war TBI, explosive TBI, different from concussive TBI that you would find on a football field The folks that I know, so I'm just speaking anecdotally now, special forces, especially the SEALs, who have to deal in very, very enclosed environments, soundproofed, taking in a lot of explosion in short periods of time, are particularly susceptible to brain injury. And so he may have had what we did not and could not then diagnose as a concussive disorder, traumatic brain injury, real brain being shaken in the cranium, in addition to the fear responses that come with being exposed to those sorts of dangers routinely, whatever other moral discourse is going on in his head about atomic explosion testings. But that's just some thoughts. But thank you. It's a very disturbing example. Very disturbing.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi. Thank
Oh,
you.
I had lunch with you earlier today. That's why
Yes.
I think I know you by first name. So my, yeah. So my question, I guess more of a comment / question, but when you've dealt with veterans, more specifically like combat veterans that have returned, have you seen cases of PTSD, maybe not necessarily from circumstances related to traumatic incidents or TBI related, but more so from the indoctrination of being in, you know, like the infantry or special operations, or that sort of indoctrined mindset of being in the military versus, you know, reacting to sort of unfortunate circumstances?
But, and just broadly speaking, PTSD,
So, I mean, all varieties. I mean, no one, there's still a lot of stigma attached to PTSD, and so people don't necessarily want to have it, and people are incredibly high functioning. So I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that the service members that return to us are not high functioning, remarkably high functioning. Some individuals just didn't want to engage with their families. They became workaholics. Work and running marathons became a way of treating. Not necessarily focused on any specific incidents, but just leaving op-tempo was very, very hard. And I think that we underestimate that. You live without sleep, you live in with a new family that's incredibly important to you and often more important than the one at home, and you are doing something that you believe is very important, at least while you're there, and may have misgivings, but you put that to the side or whatever. And I think leaving that is very disruptive, and itself can have, you know, be manifest in all sorts of ways that make it hard to come home.
Thank you.
Does that help address what?
Yeah,
you
it
have
wasn't
in
a very, it wasn't a very.
But I think
well-thought-out
it comes
question,
in all
but-
different shades and flavors of not feeling quite right here, feeling like you're an old student. I'm going to be the gray beard in class. I'm not going to say anything. Georgetown. Who do these people think they are that can start telling me about Iraq and Afghanistan and think they know so much about the State Department and what goes on there, and they never even set foot in the country? I mean, all of that rage. And some of it, like this guy, T.M. Gibbons-Neff, who we saw a while ago, he came into class and sort of saying to me, I can't tell you how many emails I've written that I didn't send. Rage at his classmates for saying, Coney 2011, we're going to send people there. Have you ever lost anyone? He had a bracelet with 3 of his buddies on. You know, he held back a lot of that, but that was a monologue he had in his mind for a long time. And, you know, I think he was really processing the war, and I'm sort of glad he was.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
hi.
Sorry, I'm in the light, so I'm peering out, and I don't have a mic without staying here.
You'd mentioned today in your afternoon lecture current challenges to NEH and NEA funding. Can you briefly describe the VETS programs that would be affected by those cuts? And possibly a related question, what can the current universities offer returning vets? And can you talk about the role of the humanities and the arts in terms of that the responsibility of the universities to vets?
Thank you. So I don't quite know the latest, but I think I know about as much as many of you do, that the NEH, and National Endowment for the Humanities, and the NEA, National Endowment for Arts, are on the cutting block, that they're about to be disbanded. They're very small budgets, as you can imagine, tiny budgets. The NEH is currently, I'm sure not currently, under Obama, maybe first or second administration, he's been there for a while, was a Vietnam veteran named Bro Adams. I don't know his first real name, I'm sorry. And he was president of Colby College, a philosopher, and one of his commitments, and I was sort of called in on this, is to have outreach to veterans. And so the NEH, and I don't know if Montana has been a recipient of this, but I'm giving a talk 2 weeks at Hunter College. I've done some others. There were NEH Dialogues on War. A big grant went out, a huge grant, grant invitation for 2-year sequences of folks in humanities and disciplines across the art. I was on some boards. Archaeology, history of medicine, philosophy, literature, art history, putting together folks in the university that could create a series of seminars that would then reach out into the community with veterans as part of the conversation, and they would bring some keynote speakers in. So I'm doing one of them, for example. That was an amazing program that got a lot of people jazzed up and a lot of very good people giving talks. And I mean, I don't know what the administration knows about the programs that the NEH actually does, but that was one of them. And it was a new initiative that, because the NEH chairman was a vet, really felt very strongly about, and the NEH hadn't done enough, he thought. And that was, so that is there will be a gap, and I would recommend people looking online to see I think they're called Dialogues on War, that it was a big, we all assumed an ongoing grant that would go on for a number of years. And there was a lot of competition for that. The NEH has also supported Aquila Theater. That's one, this is an example I know. Peter Meineck is a classicist, sort of like Brian Dories, who runs Theater of War. Theater of War is for-profit. Aquila out of NYU is nonprofit. Peter is himself a Royal Marine, he's English, and with a theater background, and then got a PhD in classics, very overtrained guy, and runs a veteran-only troupe. That is, veterans perform public theater. It's pretty remarkable. There's a ballet group I know too. Roman Baca is a Marine who was also a professional. He was classically trained and then went back into dance after leaving the Marines, and he has veteran troops. So there, funding in the arts is awful. And the humanities is not much better, but it will be a big hole, I think, because we have seen people come into our universities hungry for not just philosophy and the like, but really ways of creating and writing programs and the like. There are a lot of writing programs out there that I could talk to you about. Thank you. And I just should say, I mean, we agonize like the way Palmyra and other national monuments around the world are being destroyed so easily. We're not going to build our own if we defund in this way.
I think there's
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I didn't see the lineup.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming and speaking to us. In an attempt to not ramble, I wrote it down. If I could ask you just to speculate, perhaps in an ideal way, in regards to the task of non-veterans, namely those we might consider to be normal, everyday citizens, in the creation or the conception of a therapeutic infrastructure, what that might look like.
A therapeutic
infrastructure.
Well, maybe I guess I wouldn't say therapeutic, because some people don't like that term. I think we have to break down the walls. So, I mean, here's just a silly example, and I'll tell you how basic it is. It's the thank you for your service thing. Okay, I spent a lot of time talking about it in the book because it always kind of irked me off. I just thought, okay, what's the next sentence? Where do we go from here? What do I say? So I just started, there was a period of time you couldn't be in an airport without sitting next to someone in camis who looked like they were half asleep and never going to wake up again, and then you finally talk and you sort of say, where you been? How long are you going to be home? What do you do? What's it been like? And I would just try to have a conversation. And I think in classrooms, people aren't necessarily, they're not in fatigues, but they're very reluctant to talk unless you're just open, like talking across religion, talking across gender, talking across race. Just like that. That's, I guess, what I would say. And I think both sides. I don't believe you can only go out for a beer with the guys that were in your unit. I just think that's a lot of bull. So that's I'll get into trouble for that, but that is my view. Go out for a beer and let them start talking a bit. Okay.
Aside from the fact that the wars continue and we continue to deploy and redeploy people to the wars, I think those of us who are private citizens and not military, haven't been military, but what we're witnesses to every day, it is the ongoing struggles that veterans have in getting access to necessary medical and psychological care and social services of all kinds. And I guess my experience in working with veterans is that this is a recurring sort of wound, or a recurring wound of betrayal. It's because what they experience is betrayal time and time and time again. And then we as citizens are left feeling outraged and helpless in their behalf. And I wonder if there's a way that as citizens we could better address this problem and influence change, make some change happen. If you have some just
I'm not a
ideas
great
about
one for
that.
thinking about how to reform bureaucracy.
Well, I'm
I
thinking more,
guess.
I mean, also the political environment that keeps emphasizing the necessity to cut taxes, even
I
as
won't
we're
even go there.
injuring and re-injuring people all the time. So that's.
There are lots of private groups that, Give an Hour is a very good example, where there's volunteers doing psychological services. They've been very successful. They've had a lot of people, and that's certainly outside of a complicated system. I know Washington Psychoanalytic Institute, and many of the therapy organizations are very much trying to do more for veterans. I did an online set of talks for the American Psychoanalytic Association, just to sort of talk about war trauma, so more people that are providers and counselors who are willing to do pro bono work or at low fee, et cetera, can be exposed a little bit to the current, or understand a little bit the current military population. And I think that's important. But there is a national shortage of clinicians across all different credentialing agencies, I believe. But thank you. Yes. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for coming. And
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I'm somebody that's never been in the military. I came of age in '67. I went to university because I wanted to. I wasn't avoiding the draft. The lottery happened. I didn't have to think about it. So I don't know what percentage of people in the audience are military and non-military. I've worked with people in wildland fire in Alaska. This was in the early 70s. Some came back from Marine platoons, I guess, or they were one of the only few survivors. And as far as the testosterone part of it goes, somebody that was doing what I was doing was, I don't know, less than 5 feet. He had to get tricked his congressman to get him an appointment in the Marines. And then another person, a woman, trying to get into the same job in the 70s, which he finally did, went through the same testosterone-laced environment. So I don't know what it's like in the military. And can you speak towards that for us that have never been?
What is like?
Well, when you're talking to people that were deployed and how they feel about those who are not.
I don't think we should have preconceived ideas.
Well, I don't know.
We're in I take it this university is not unlike mine. People have come home hungry for educations. Some feel guilty about it. One more thing that will take me away from my family. One more for me.
Well, I don't know if that comes up.
Well, and I mean, my work has been, over the past 20 years, has been dedicated to making people feel they're not exotic breed. There was a time when, most in your family, most of your family had served, and I have not served. My brother did not serve. My husband did not serve. My father, grandfather served. My uncle served. So I just think we have barriers on both sides and their defenses. And this is not to say that there aren't support groups. Vet centers are critical, all the different sorts of outreach groups, but so too are just people who have amputees. Don't assume that that you can't talk to them because they have come home from war legless or limbless. They're just another person to chat with. On that subject, I'm just quick, somewhere I might have this. This is a guy I came to know pretty well, Dan Bershinsky. I'm just mentioning it. He lost his hips and his legs in Kandahar, and he ends up going to Stanford Business School. He's a West Point graduate. My son was at Stanford Business School during time, and this is to say, break down the barriers, my dear. I said, Jonathan, have you seen Dan around campus? He's on a Segway a lot. You might see his graduate school business. You might see him. And he said, yeah, but I'm not quite sure how to start the conversation, Mom. I said, my God, like you're my son, you don't know how to start the conversation. Get over it, kid. That's my answer. Oh, okay. Thank you for deferring.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot about moral harm, so I guess I have a twofold question. Do you feel like the moral harm or injury is just as prominent or likely in a non-combat garrison situation where it's the military culture? And then do you feel like the military's authoritarianism bureaucratic system, in order to address those issues, is adequate to help solve and resolve and prevent some of those moral injuries?
Great. No, I don't think it's just battlefield. It can be off. I'm not narrowing my understanding of moral injury to include stressors that have to do with explosives or grotesqueries of war or the like. Would I know how to, I'm not a social scientist, quantitatively say whether some are more severe or not, or when the recurrences what the time lags are. In terms of addressing it, it's I've talked to many across different branches. They really are trying to destigmatize psychological and moral injury. It was the Army under the Secretary of Navy, Secretary of Army, who tried very, very hard to get rid of the D in disorder, PTSD. And the American Psychiatric Association thought they was crazy. Like, I don't get, disorders are how you list things in the manual to get treatment. And so it didn't go anywhere, but they were working on it. They're working on they set up commissions to do with suicide. I was on a suicide review board at the Pentagon where we would have screens like this, 6 of them around the room with all the generals popping in from different posts around the world, debriefing on suicides that had happened on their watch, so to speak. it was, and so what are the lessons learned? Where do we go from here was the constant response, but I'm not sure there was a smoking gun. And there's a look for biomarkers. What are the what are the indicators? I'll tell you one way to manage it is to take away some of the arms of individuals when they come home from war. It's huge, the cause of suicide by having arms at home, as well as as well as getting rid of the meds that are no longer needed. So it will be very, very ongoing. And it's, last sort of word on this, it's not separate from public culture. The stigma against psychological injury and mental health is across the divide. So long as we have it in the public, in the civilian world, we will have it in the military world. It's a public epidemic issue.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think this is the last question, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious to hear if there were any clear treatments and therapies that you noticed through the vets you were working with that worked particularly well to help rehabilitate.
Well, the ones that are playing around with slides here, I'll just stop it. Just get it back to the book. The ones that are evidence-based with a fairly good track record are CBT, CPT, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, forms of prolonged exposure therapy. But they're often, there's a lot of discussion on this, they're often based on deconditioning fear, and that may not work so well for getting someone to really probe issues of guilt or betrayal or a sense of falling short of standards or a sense of having done something wrong when it turns out they really didn't. So, and folks, the leading individuals who do clinical work in moral injury are Brett Litz is one such person at Boston VA who has a terribly named, I think, program called Adaptive Disclosure, which is a way of, sort of like some things I've written about in the book. It's a way of encouraging self-empathy. If you have an empty chair technique, this is the case where you feel awful guilt being responsible for the death of one of your unit mates because you could have done more, could have been there, could have done more, and so you hold yourself culpable. And so you have an empty chair and you bring them back, that individual back into the room. What would he say to you? What would she say to you? Would she hold you as accountable as you hold yourself? I'm giving you a very short version of it. It's not how it works in therapy. But that is being experimented with as a way of opening the model a bit to talk about the blaming attitude that can be overly punitive and bringing another voice in to hold you accountable in a different way, to forgive you, to allow you to be compassionate to yourself. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, should we have to turn this off?